Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And here we are back again with a brand new guest, somebody who I've been familiar with for quite a while. I booked him on Tinfoil Hat a couple years ago. Big fan of several of his books and very pleased to have him on the show today. Author and futurist Eric Wargo joins us. Eric, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. And for folks who might be learning about you for the first time, can you give us a little summary of what you like to research and write about?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. It's great. It's a pleasure being on your show. Yeah, so I write about precognition and related topics in physics and time and temporality and causality. Um, and that tangents other topics in the current zeitgeist like UFOs and things like that. Um, yeah, I so precognition, if you don't know, is the ability to be influenced by future events, future experiences. Um, it's People have thought of it in different ways. I mean, you can think of prophecy, you can think of premonitions, people having dreams about disasters or deaths in the future. It's, I believe, a an extremely common universal phenomenon in humans, and in fact, more broadly in the animal kingdom. Uh, and it's one that is still not acknowledged by mainstream psychological science, but I think that's bound to change uh, in the nearer or midterm future as we learn more about the physical processes that would allow such a thing. I mean, it's been regarded as sort of absurd by mainstream scientists for a long time because our uh, ordinary understanding of causation and causality is that it goes in one direction, and the idea of, you say, having a dream that foretells a future event just violates that. But we are learning in physics, and in fact, it's been argued in physics for a century or more by now, that the idea of unilinear causation may not be a complete story. And There's growing evidence, in fact, experimental evidence even, in from physics experiments, showing that causes can travel in reverse. Travel is kind of a problematic usage when we're talking about this, but you have to stick with words that are understood. And the idea of causes sort of traveling back from the future is now an increasingly accepted idea in physics. And the sort of parallel realm of quantum computing is showing that in quantum computers you can actually possibly send information from the future into the past. Well, I've argued in my books, for instance, my first book, Time Loops, that that's what the brain is. It's a kind of quantum computer, or it has quantum computing properties, and that through some mechanism we don't fully understand, it is receiving information from its own future states. The brain, the nervous system is receiving information from its own future states. And that this allows things like precognitive dreams or having autonomic reactions to stimuli that are going to happen in a few seconds, which has been shown again and again and again in experiments. Um, so, yeah, I think the future of physics in the next few decades is really going to explore this a lot more. And I think once physicists start talking more openly about retrocausation, they're already starting to, but I think once it becomes more sort of widely understood that, oh, retrocausation is a thing, I think biologists and psychologists will start to maybe not regard things like precognition as so absurd, and they'll start taking a serious look at these things.
Yeah, I love how you elaborate on the topic of retro causality because it does have so far reaching implications and really at the heart of Western civilization, the idea of a prophet and what a prophet is, and the prophets who have shaped Western civilization it's almost in a way like we've gone so far that we don't even recognize the legitimacy of something like a prophet. And this might be a way of doing that. I mean, it kind of even secularizes the idea of a prophet in the sense that, you know, it doesn't necessarily always have to be religious messages. And you give some great examples of that in your latest book. When I was reading it, I was really quite surprised because I have been reading Tolkien for other reasons, and Tolkien comes up in your latest book, Where Was It Before the Dream? Time Loops and Interpretation. And unlike your other books, which sort of give more real world examples, you dove into the literary world, which, you know, most people I think are surprisingly very familiar with. You know, I thought I didn't know anything about Frankenstein, and then I'm reading this. I'm like, oh yeah, I do remember that from school. And it's very interesting because it turns out that Frankenstein itself might be something like a precognitive monster. Can you help the audience understand that, and how Mary Shelley sort of reached into her future to create this story?
Yeah, well, my big interest in let me like rewind a little to give a little bit of the backstory to this book. But my big interest in precognition, even back when I was writing Time Loops, which came out like in 2018, I think, um, has been in its relation to creativity. I mean, a lot of people write about precognition and dreams and so on, and I wrote a book about that topic. I mean, and that's certainly a topic that uh, it affects a lot of people, and I was getting bombarded by emails, people wanting to know about dreams and stuff. But I am so fascinated with the idea that precognition could be at the roots of the creative process and creative inspiration. And so I've just written a series of two books essentially on that topic. The first one being From Nowhere, which came out last year, and then the new book, Where Was It Before the Dream? Uh, these were originally a single gigantic book, which I was advised to split into two because they are a little bit different. But my argument in From Nowhere was that what if I'm basically posing the question, what if what we call inspiration is really precognition? And then I give a lot of examples from visual artists, writers, filmmakers, and so on that sort of build that argument. Um, there's like an even sort of further argument, further place that you can take that. And that's the topic of the new book, which is that um, if if it's true that you know artists are tapped into their future somehow, and then they are creating out of that, that future state. Um, According to the rules of retrocausation and the rules of how information would have to work in a time traveling universe um, that I describe, causation has to be kind of circular in a way. Prophecies on some level have to be self fulfilling. And this is something that the ancients knew perfectly well. I mean, you look at old myths like Oedipus or stories like Macbeth and so on. Prophecy always, fulfills itself even in the process of a person trying to evade the prophecies, and that's the kind of ironic logic that governs human life in a world where information can time travel, for instance, in a person's head. Well, I think this logic governs the lives of artists, uh, and uh, and even more so, it makes creation into something like really miraculous. And I mean that word truly, because it makes if an artist is uh, getting information about their future, particularly if they're foretelling how they're going to look back on a work of art, for instance, that they created in a state of inspiration that was based on something in their future, well, that creates what I call a time loop. Okay. And it also creates what science fiction writers have often called a bootstrap paradox. And the bootstrap paradox is where the classic example of this is if you have a time traveler from the future delivering the plans for a time machine to himself in the past, and his younger self builds the time machine based on those plans. well, where did the know-how to build the time machine come from? There's no place in history or in that loop where someone actually did the work of figuring out how to make a time machine. It was just it's just a loop. It just bootstrapped itself into existence. And another way of putting that is creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, which is what God did in the first part of Genesis, right? Well, this idea fascinates me, that this logic could be going on in the lives of writers, particularly because one of the big turning points in the lives of writers, particularly young writers, is the response and reaction to their first sort of debut work. Their first work that sort of transformed them from an aspiring writer into an author. And that's a real big turning point in a person's life. And and it's those kinds of turning points that people tend to precognize. And so I think that a lot of the most imaginative writers, maybe every writer, but at least the imaginative writers I look at in this book, were often precognizing how they would look back on their early masterpieces, and that those early masterpieces are thus prophecies of how they were going to look back on itself, essentially. So there's this really looping nature of creative causality
Hmm.
going on with these stories. And Frankenstein is one of the examples that I use, because I think now the argument is it's a pretty lengthy argument, but in a nutshell, it's kind of uncanny that this creature that came to Mary Shelley in this kind of hypnagogic state, when she was trying to sleep after this sort of exciting conversation with her friends and husband in a chalet in Switzerland. Um, this vision that came to her, which became the nucleus of her story, is of a creature that was composed of the parts of a bunch of different creatures that had been stolen. Okay, but somehow enlivened, and given life, okay, by this scientist. Um, Now, what's weird is that her story, the novel Frankenstein, which was first published, I think, in 1818, yeah, January 1st, 1818, I believe. Um, it quickly became the center of sort of all this discourse and criticism, wondering how she came up with this idea. And critics immediately started, and she herself immediately started giving an explanation for how this idea came together. Well, in the process of reconstructing her creative process, and she put this in a preface to a third version of her novel, she sort of explained how all these different scientific ideas that she'd heard, about early experiments with animating frogs' legs and stuff with electricity and things like that, lots of stuff. How this was all must have been soaked up by her brain, and then and turned into a novel. Well, long story short, her novel became an exemplar of the idea of influences, literary influences, being thieved essentially from other places, including other writers like Coleridge and stuff that she had soaked up, and then being somehow put together and assembled and having some kind of spontaneous inner life, that you can't really explain. So it's weird that the monster, that came to her in this little vision and that she built a story around, was almost like a premonition of how she would be sort of forced to explain her own creativity after the fact, decades later, years and decades later.
Hmm.
And I think there's that uncanny resemblance between her sort of later accounting of her creative process and this vision that came to her and that she built a story around, is a perfect example of a creative idea sort of bootstrapping itself into existence. I mean, the monster, I believe, bootstrapped itself into existence out of her own kind of recollection and her attempt to sort of account for her creativity, and she had a premonition essentially of that hindsight accounting for her
Yeah.
creativity. And it took the form of this wonderful symbol of this creature rising from a slab in a laboratory, as this alive, it's alive, you know, being who's built of all these different stolen parts, you know? And so all the examples that I give in the book are sort of like that I'm trying to show or argue, I guess, that uh, that there's evidence here, and you have to be a little bit on board with this idea of precognition, obviously. But there's evidence in these cases that the author was essentially their initial inspiration for their story was a premonition of how they were going to look back on that story and in hindsight, in light of maybe being transformed into an author and sort of being asked about their creative process and or maybe being criticized by critics
Well,
or
and at a time when a female author was a rare thing, something that was probably double scrutinized, and then not to mention the whole backstory of her very,
scandalous
rambunctious,
life.
scandalous, thank you, that's the
Yes.
right word, scandalous
Yep.
life, and her husband who had a wife who committed suicide, and obviously she was playing some role in that and felt guilty for it, and she just had this tornado of death around her, as you put, these all these dead bodies in her life, and the fact that her magnum opus is a corpse, like this dead body, I think is double ironic. And you use the term homunculus, which is funny because we just had a big conversation with another guest about the alchemical homunculus. And in a way, Frankenstein is like a triple layered homunculus because it's a story about a homunculus, but the story itself is a homunculus. And this is all from Mary Shelley's homunculus in this precognitive way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a fractal. I mean, the term I use for that kind of nested, that kind of recursive, nested nature of these of precognitive art is a fractal. I mean, it's like a fractal geometry. The more you zoom in, you keep finding the same thing at different levels of scrutiny or whatever. And I think
Yeah.
that's I call that kind of a biomarker of precognitive art. There's always this kind of way in which it's recursive in a way, and I think that's kind of what you're describing.
Yeah. I think there's something potent about a story like this, and the precognitive elements maybe are predicated on the collective consciousness, because Frankenstein also hits a very important chord at a time when humanity is also transitioning from an agrarian, monarchical, religious sort of lifestyle to what becomes the Industrial Revolution and everything that is an aftermath of that, right? And in Frankenstein, you have this sort of double sword effect of the monster of technology, but then you write how the result of stories like Frankenstein are films like Jurassic Park, Terminator, Alien, these films that are meant to put us in a sort of state of skepticism about our technological progress, but really end up giving us like a foray to fetishize these technologies. And you look at like all the fan fiction and the sci-fi that's grown out of those mainstays. It's, yeah, you make a really great point.
Yeah, yeah, that point it's so funny that people like stay on that level of seeing like maybe Jurassic Park is like, well, it's sort of a warning about playing God or whatever like that. It was like, no, it's fetishizing it totally, but it's letting you off the hook by having the the Malcolm character, saying, well, you essentially you played God and you didn't, wonder about the consequences. It's like, well, okay, that lets us off the hook for really just enjoying enjoying this and like being thrilled at the possibility of cloning dinosaurs. Yeah, it's like people have often said that, Frankenstein was this warning about playing God. And that, like, here's where I agree with, one of the main critics that I criticize in the chapter. She's saying, like, no, Mary Shelley was totally a materialist. She was an atheist. She loved technology and science and was like super thrilled at these ideas and possibilities. This was not intended as a warning about playing God.
Right. Right. It has been conveniently coached as that, but yeah, it is interesting because she was not the type to think much about these things in a spiritual way, you can say, unlike Tolkien, who we're about to talk to. But yeah, Mary Shelley is kind of interesting because she's around all these very cutting edge minds. She's sort of synthesizing a lot of the ideas she's hearing between her partner and Lord Byron. And in this way, yeah, brings a perfect icon for the Industrial Revolution into to bear, right? I mean, Frankenstein is this industrial monster.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, and you mentioned how there's this anxiety of Shelley being perceived as a thief. This same thing is going on with Tolkien, right? And let's start to peel back that onion because Tolkien, it's one thing to talk about the altered state that he went into to write these books. I want to elaborate on that. But I'm curious if you think that his expertise in Scandinavian folklore allowed him to synthesize all this stuff, maybe put him into a more alter, because we're talking about retro causality and reaching into the future, but with Tolkien it almost seems like he was reaching into the past through these texts that he was reading. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I think that he was reaching. No, I mean, I would say he was reaching into. Certainly, he was immersed in this mythology, in this sort of mythological world of of sure of Norse myths and Anglo-Saxon mythology and so on. But that's not the real past. I mean, that's a mythic past, and so, you could talk about that imaginal or whatever as a imaginal spirit world or whatever. And sure, I mean, some people that's that, he has been described as a shaman who essentially, ventured into a spirit world. I mean, he wrote in a kind of trance. And and you could talk about the objective reality of the spirit world. And what I'm arguing is not like necessarily contradicting that, but I think there's evidence in his writing that he was in that trance, definitely channeling events, concrete events in his like embodied future. Um, uh, and again, especially, this is especially visible. I'm not as much of a scholar of like the Lord of the Rings. I mean, I've certainly read it many times and I love it, but I'm not, I don't know every detail of it. But I do think his first book, The Hobbit, it can be shown that that he was whatever else he was doing, he was having a premonition, essentially a literary premonition of how the Hobbit would change his life. And it's an exam that kind of fractal thing where there's just, Hobbit is just essentially it's strewn with these kind of little precognitive or premonition elements uh,
Right.
that sort of can be tied to how he was going to look back on his writing of The Hobbit in hindsight.
Well, and it's very much tied into his academic life as a professor and the idea that maybe his peers will call into question the legitimacy of his tenure, given he is writing, fiction, fantasy, instead of maybe writing, historical essays about what he's researched. But in a sense, through the Silmarillion, he creates this sort of, I don't know, a working intermediary between the mythologies and our language, our world. And then in that, he sort of pens himself as Bilbo Baggins.
Mhm.
And again, there's this sort of thief motif where I think the anxiety of that tenure being called into question is channeled into Bilbo Baggins being brought along this journey as a thief who never wanted to be a thief,
Right.
right?
Right. But then enjoyed being a thief.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, I can run through sort of the basic argument. Uh, he writes this, starting in the probably around 1930. We don't know exactly. He writes on the back of a student's exam paper this sentence that just comes to him: "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." Okay, didn't know what that meant. Didn't know what a hobbit was. Had no clue. But it's like, this happens with a lot of writers. There's just something comes out of the blue, and they sort of start to explore it, in their writing. Now, he didn't never thought he started writing these episodes about Bilbo Baggins, this hobbit, in the Shire, and this series of adventures kind of strung along with these dwarves. But he never intended publishing this. These were all just kind of these entertaining little stories to read to his kids, which were young at the time. Okay, so he was creating essentially these little children's stories to read to his kids. Um, and never in any intention of publishing this. Like his big dream was publishing what later became published as the Silmarillion, all that mythological stuff that he'd been working on since World War One. That was his ultimate. If he was going to publish any of this stuff, it was going to be that stuff. But anyway, so he's writing these stories, and then like 6 years later, he's written a number of these things, and nobody even knows about this except his family and then one of his students. Um, Named Susan Dagnall. Uh, and she, I may be getting that wrong. Susan Dagnall might be the publisher. Yeah, it was another woman. Anyway, one of his students knew about this and told this person working for the publisher, Allen and Unwin, that Professor Tolkien had this story that they might want to publish it. And so they send their agent, like Susan Dagnall, around to his house. Um, she knocks on his door and asks him for this manuscript. And so he gives it to him, and this publisher thinks, oh, this could work, can you finish it for us, and submit it, and they love it, and they publish it. Now, um, so it's really funny that he winds up having lunch. He finds up finally meeting um, Stanley Unwin, one of the publishing partners. He finally meets Stanley Unwin, like right when the book is coming out, like a year after he submits it. And they meet in London for lunch, and he finds that Stanley Unwin is just like one of the dwarves in his book. Okay, he's small. He sort of had the same beard and glasses, and it's just exactly like he pictured his dwarves. And and then I pointed, I mean, he didn't realize this, but the names Alan and Unwin, that fits right in there. Thorin, Balin, Dwalin, Alan and Unwin. And Susan Dagnall, who had originally knocked on his door to get the manuscript. Dagnall is almost a perfect anagram of Gandalf. So it's like, and at this lunch with this dwarf looking Unwin, that Unwin is asking him for more hobbits. We need a hobbit. Because they're asking him at this point for a sequel. This was the lunch that led to the Lord of the Rings ultimately. Um, and it's like this, like it's almost as if the premise of the Hobbit is like this premonition of what happened to him, as a result of submitting his manuscript to Allen and Unwin. It's again one of these like bootstrapping kind of situations. Um, and yes, the thief stuff that you talked about is fantastic. I mean, his big fear in all this is that his Oxford colleagues are going to think that that this is what they've been doing, that this is what he's been doing with that fellowship money they gave him, which was writing like fantasy novels and not doing his real work. So he thought, he was worried that he was going to be thought of as a thief. And of course, the great literary device in that book is of course a ring, which enables Bilbo to essentially become a thief without being seen or without being caught. Um, so, yeah, there's, I think The Hobbit, and there are a lot of other little things I examine in The Hobbit that seem very precognitive about Tolkien. But I think that this was a literary premonition of his transformation from a writer, a kind of a quiet, unassuming writer, tucked away in his little Hobbit hole in the suburbs, uh, and becoming a famous author. And yeah, I mean, it's his life is fascinating. There's so much to say about Tolkien.
Yeah, it's interesting. I maybe it's because of the other conversations I've had recently, but I want to believe that the Silmarillion is somehow, translated ancient texts that we lost, and that's why Tolkien thought it was so important to publish it, and maybe why he got so much resistance. With our tinfoil hats on over here, we can speculate why, but we don't need to spend too much time doing that. I am curious, though, where that intersects with time loops and, in the sense, the notion that history repeats itself, because it does feel like that is kind of at the heart of what Tolkien was aiming for, these sort of world myths, these grand from beginning to end, this great, drama of the human experience. It's much more than just one lifetime. It's the entirety of our existence. And yeah, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on something like the Kali Yuga, or one of these great scales of time that seem to be showing that we're in a cyclical relationship with time? It seems to match up with your research.
I'm more interested in time loops as they operate on the human scale, on the scale of our lives. I have no authority to speak to, the great cycles of existence. I'm not a metaphysician or a cosmologist, and I'm a sometime mystic, but I don't have any great insight into that. Certainly, yes, he was articulating uh, a very private and very unique, I guess, take on that kind of idea, which is a perennial idea in the spiritual traditions of the world. And it's what's so amazing is that he just sort of created this out of his own, you know, out of his own like research and he felt like he was reconstructing something. You're right. I mean, he felt like he was reconstructing a real kind of mythic uh, past that the fragments of myth and story that we have from the Scandinavian myths and Anglo-Saxon myths that were just like little fragments that gave him hints, and that he was really reconstructing something real, if not a real historical past, a real mythic uh, past uh, that was certainly equally grand and fascinating and beautiful and profound as I think anything that you'd find in any world religion.
Right.
And it's incredible that he sort of just did this,
So,
uh,
w-
and yeah, and it makes me wonder the extent to which his mythology could serve as the basis of a religion, and I wonder how many people actually treat it that way. I mean, certainly, um,
I'm
I think
sure
more and more people do, and
I'm sure it's a big reason why there's so many neo-pagans that have
yeah,
become,
you're
yeah,
right. Yeah,
it's definitely It's definitely tied into there. I'm sure there's some sociologist who's written a paper about it. But
Right.
Tolkien, I want to ask you about his altered states because he believed that poetic imagination was a creative superpower of his, a semi divine superpower. And he called this altered state fairy, which is, really interesting considering I just spoke with a woman in England who has a podcast where she speaks with modern fairy people who have encountered fairies in the modern era. And it happens. And one of the themes that she has deduced from all of her conversations is that people seem to interact with fairies at transitional points in their life. And this kind of hits at exactly what you just said about Mary Shelley earlier. And I'm sure Tolkien as well, considering, his transition from professor, very comfortable sort of hermitage of his own home, then to becoming literally in the top 10 list of most famous authors
Mhm.
worldwide. I mean, that's a big change. Even if you don't live to see a lot of that fame, it's a big change. So
Yeah.
yeah, the altered states. What do we know about this?
Well, we don't know a huge ton. I mean, he didn't write certainly in any literalistic way about it. However, um, there's a writer on shamanism who wrote a really nice, or I think it's a couple actually, who wrote a really nice book about Tolkien as a shaman, and I'm blanking on their names, but this they pointed out that that his story, and the name of the story will come to me. It's this little story about this sort of uh, this character that sort of has this ability to go into fairy essentially, uh, and that in that story he was essentially encoding his beliefs about this altered state and how to sort of access it. Um, the name of the story will come to me, and the name of the authors will come to me hopefully. Uh, but yeah, he so what we know is that he sort of went into a trance. Trance is kind of a loose term. It's sort of hard to know exactly what that means. My guess is that it was very similar to what Jung called active imagination, which is where you sort of, you kind of relax the mind and kind of relax the ego and try and kind of go into a sort of hypnagogic dream world without completely falling asleep. And some people have this ability. Some people are able to kind of sit in this somewhat almost semi-dream kind of world and be lucid enough that they can remember what they're encountering and sometimes even write during that state. Now, I have tried and tried and tried in my life and I can't do it, but I do know someone who does essentially this. She calls it active dreaming. I wrote about her actually in my dream workbook. Um, and certainly Carl Jung developed a facility with this. Some people can do it. Shamans can do it. People who have that kind of shamanic aptitude can kind of become stable in a sort of semi-trance, semi-dream, sort of hypnagogic, kind of liminal state and kind of remain in that state and sort of channel from it. And that that's what Tolkien seemed to be doing. He seemed to be sort of glimpsing things in this state, sort of writing, I guess, making notes on what he was seeing, and then sort of writing an exegesis of these notes. Um, and that's what became the Silmarillion. Okay. I don't think that he wrote the Lord of the Rings in that state exactly. That sort of it's that kind of background, that kind of mythological background to the world, sort of his world building. I think that's what he was getting in that fairy state that he called.
Hmm.
Um, but we don't know. exactly. We don't know exactly what was written in what state
Right.
and so on. I think the actual composition of his stories, though, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, I think that was done a more conscious process of exegesis. It was kind of a conscious kind of interpretation of these things that he was seeing in this trance.
Right. Right. And there are some letters, I don't know that this is directly mentioned in your book, but there are some letters of his that sort of hint at him accessing the information in these ancient texts that were available through the library at Oxford. And obviously, him being one of the few people who could read those languages, he had kind of like sole authority to share it with the world, again adding to that pressure and maybe also adding to that feeling of not being wholly original and almost like a thief, like, hey, I'm taking all these ancient texts and repurposing them for a modern age, and you guys are so, unaware of where these come from that you think they're mine and they're not, right? Like that could be very much at play here. I'd like to think so, considering a lot of what we talk about. It's very reminiscent of a story called the Bach Saga, which could just be the crazy ramblings of a cult leader, but it does sort of fit into that same world of ideas. And in a sense, Tolkien is no different than a, homeless schizophrenic when he goes into these trance states. He's just a lot more organized than maybe the average person, reeling with drug addiction and trauma and mental illness, that also goes into these trance states. They're not always productive. But I think there was a time in human history where our communities were more cohesive. We had a better sort of grasp over keeping everyone healthy. And because of that, when mental illnesses like that did arise, maybe they were able to use this person to a utilitarian benefit. They trained them as a shaman, and those trance states were then navigable rather than confusing and chaotic. I don't know, just a speculation. I don't have a lot of basis for that, but it does feel like at the heart of our abilities as humans is this sort of precognitive sense. And maybe we can go back into some of your earlier work and talk about just precognition in general. You mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, just briefly, the psi reflex, or being able to sort of predict something happening to you. Talk to me about this. Is this directly related to snakes? Because I feel like I've read something that, biologists and evolutionary scientists will say that humans developed this because of snakes, because we're so adapted around snakes being this huge enemy of ours biologically. I feel like that might be maybe trying to reduce things down to material realm. What do you think about that?
You mean the ability to sense danger
Right.
and,
Right.
yeah, respond to danger? Well, there's all kinds of dangers. I mean, like, in some environments it's snakes, in some environments it's, venomous spiders, in some it's tigers, it's some it's, there's
Right.
all kinds of threats that can kill you especially if you're a vulnerable, ape, living in the edge of some forest in Africa or somewhere. So I mean, there's all kinds of threats, and I think, in fact, I was reading something interesting. Psychological studies were done on this idea of snakes as being somehow, there's this idea that we have this intrinsic fear of snakes because because of our evolutionary past, growing up in or evolving in environments like Africa where there's black mambas and stuff that can kill you. But actually, small children don't have that intrinsic fear of snakes. I even saw a video of this experiment where they had like little, toddlers and 1-year-olds in a room, and they put obviously non-venomous snakes in the room, and they had no aversion to these animals at all. So it sort of seemed to show that actually it's a learned reflex, not
Wow.
some intrinsic archetype or something. So who knows? But I mean, I think, yeah, certainly precognition is an adaptive uh, thing. It guides us you know, away from dangers and toward rewards. So I think, you can make a very, reductive biological evolutionary argument for precognition as a guidance system, that's adaptive for the survival and perpetuation of a species. And you know, I really think that this is very basic to life. That it may have been the first guidance system of bacteria, in the primordial soup, and it's just scaled up in all kinds of ways in more complex organisms.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's about survival, certainly.
Well, but I get the sense that it's not limited to that. And I guess what I'm trying to get at in a clunky sort of way is that our physical reality, as much as we want to try to explain things through purely our physical reality, it seems like precognition is kind of pointing us towards a consciousness first reality, or at least that maybe, and you maybe you disagree with this, but I'm curious your thoughts on this. And yeah, if you think that maybe uh, the notion is that the reason why these things are possible is because we're connected to something that isn't adhering to what we think of as the linear progression of time. We're tapped into something greater than that.
Um, well, I think you could simply say that our understanding of the linear progression of time is just wrong, and time, space, everything. The world is just a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting, honestly, than what 3 centuries, 4 centuries of Enlightenment physics has. I won't say dictated, because, scientists really, for the most part, are not like dogmatic. They follow the evidence and they follow the theory and so on. And paradigms change when they need to. And I think paradigms will change around this, and we will come to understand that, retrocausation is real. Time is this way more complicated thing than we've ever assumed or thought. Um, as far as whether precognition is pointing us towards something, toward a higher reality, I don't know. I tend to, first of all, I kind of have a resistance to the tendency nowadays to think of everything in terms of consciousness. I'm kind of like, this is a term that nobody really understands, and no two people agree on what they mean. People think they know what they mean by this term, but they really don't. And there's a million different definitions of consciousness, and hundreds of theories of consciousness, ranging from the most materialistic to the most uh, whatever is the opposite of that. We have a million different definitions flying around, and I'm happy, I don't know, at this point, to just set aside that term, because I don't think it's very helpful, certainly not in explaining precognition. And I'll tell you why. I mean, really, this goes back to why I keep harping on Freud and the psychoanalytic tradition, because uh, Freud was the first scientist. Some would question whether he was really that much of a scientist, but he was the first scientist to talk about the unconscious, and that is to say, things that move us and animate us, and things we do that we do not have conscious awareness of. And it's really interesting to me that precognition manifests in all those ways that interested Freud. So dreams and slips of the tongue and neurotic symptoms, and uh, this is where precognition comes in, or trance states, those kind of liminal states that are kind of on the border of dream and waking. Um, it's very hard to consciously exercise precognition. I mean, it's just, you know, some people will claim that they can tap into it consciously, but it's almost always enters in some kind of oblique, unconscious way. And that's why I think the term consciousness is not very helpful for trying to understand this stuff. I find the psychoanalytic idiom, even if there's a lot of stuff that we need to set aside that Freud said that was wrong or whatever, nevertheless, that sort of general picture of us as having a very large unconscious domain, that you know, animates us, and we don't know why or how. That to me is the more interesting kind of level for looking at precognition. And I think I argued in time loops that uh, Freud essentially provided a ready-made theory of precognition. He just didn't realize what it was. He didn't believe in precognition. He thought he was talking about that kind of submerged part of the iceberg, that was sort of going on in secret uh, in our heads or whatever. But I argue that that submerged part of the iceberg is really our future. It's our future that is influencing us, pulling us, guiding us, um, getting us into trouble if we have, a kind of a fraught relationship to these capabilities, these precognitive capabilities. That's where we should locate the unconscious. It's the future. It's our future, our personal future. Um, so that's why I kind of uh, I sort of I like to bring it back to the individual's life, the individual's life, their sort of his history, their history in the future. What is going to happen to you that is that may be causing you to act a certain way now. I think that's a fascinating question, and it's unanswerable, obviously, because it's not the future yet. But if we can become more acquainted with the logic, the sort of weird, ironic logic whereby our future influences us, or whereby we can learn how our present somehow influenced our past. For instance, in a dream that we realized was precognitive, or an artwork which we realized, oh my God, I'm living this situation right now that I wrote about in this, novel that I wrote 10 years ago, or a short story, or a song, or whatever it was. If we can become attuned to that logic, we can kind of learn more about ourself, our long self. I call it the long self, that, our biography as it extends through time, a few decades through time. Um, so yeah, I'm kind of more interested in that unconscious thing, and that way in which this connects us, to, I think, lower creatures. I'm not so interested in where we're evolving toward, but where we've come from. And whether it's orienting us towards some higher consciousness, I don't know, but I'm more interested in the unconscious, really.
Yeah. Now, where does this fit into the idea of karma? Because it almost sounds to me like you're not saying that we're all predestined and that there's some sort of script that, we're living out that we don't, necessarily get to write. Seems like there's an interplay between the two where based on our actions in the now, our future is kind of rewritten constantly. Like it's laid out, but it can change.
Well, the can it? I mean, this is the implication in what I'm writing, and in my I guess the physics and the cosmology that I kind of accept, is that the future actually already exists, and our belief, and that throws a big monkey wrench into our beliefs about free will, and about what we're doing when we are acting on an intention, and so on. I think ultimately these things, these realities, um, of precognition and so on, and retrocausation, are going to have to force us to rethink what it means to be human. And a lot of people hate that. A lot of people like, well, wait, don't take away my free will, you know. Um, but honestly, that's a very I think it's a very Western hangup, to worry about our free will and our agency and being responsible for our actions and so on. I mean, that's, sort of intrinsic to Western capitalist, culture. But, a lot of Eastern cultures don't have that hangup. I'm personally, my tradition, my spiritual practice is Zen. And one of the things that comes up again and again in Zen enlightenment experiences is this kind of realization that you're kind of this or sort of dropping that baggage of free will, and acting more spontaneously and authentically, but also in a way that you're not some kind of free agent in the world, that you're sort of, in a sense, a participant, or an observer, participating in creating reality, but uh, not worried about free will so much. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that these are thinking about precognition and retrogression really forces a kind of reevaluation of what that free will notion means. And I would say that if we exert free will, we're exerting free will on our past rather than our future. Through that kind of precognitive or presentimental mechanism, we are fulfilling things, we're fulfilling situations in our future. But it's our future consciousness that reflects, that looks back, that we're precognizing. So it's like, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's complicated. I don't think it's as simple as having free will and changing the future and um, changing our outcomes.
Yeah, the audience might need to rewind and take that all in a second time. So go ahead and do that, folks. But I think I'm with you. And, I've had this radical acceptance of what will be for quite a while now. It's part of why my family thinks I'm crazy. And I think, that's led me down the path that has ultimately created this podcast, which when I dropped out of college, I didn't even know what a podcast was. So in a sense, like I couldn't have found this path, but I did have a sense that I was going to be doing something related to all these books I was obsessed with buying and reading. And sure enough, here I am talking to great authors like you. So I can attest to that in a way. I sort of saw the carrot on the stick and I followed it, and little did I know it was leading to right behind me in a sense, like this feedback loop, this Ouroboros, which the ancients saw in the sky as the Milky Way. They carved it into stone. It was a sacred symbol. And maybe this is why. Maybe they recognize the uh, retrocausality of our world. Have you seen this in ancient cultures? Have you taken stock of that and tried to look for this concept in human cultures from the past?
Well, you just mentioned the Ouroboros. I mean,
Right.
that's a an ancient Gnostic symbol of what you can interpret it in different ways, but I think that that's what it's talking about, and that's a theme that I get into in the Becoming Time-Faring book that I also just wrote, that talking about the Ouroboros. And there are so many ideas of creation as being a cyclical thing, and what it means to either embrace that or break out of that cyclical nature, and so on. But it's so many ancient religions have the same Ouroboros. The Norse, they had their Midgard serpent, who was the Ouroboros that encircled the world, tail and mouth and so on. Um, and I think at the end of the time there was going to be a war, and I forget whether the war at the end of time was somehow about slaying that serpent or not. I can't. Can you do you remember? I don't know,
Something
but
about the rainbow bridge breaking and then joining back again. Yeah.
maybe, yeah. So yeah, this is a very ancient idea,
Mm,
very ancient idea.
mm. Well, let's take a step into the future then. I haven't read your the book you mentioned being the first part of the one we've been talking about today, but I am curious where this all fits into this UAP UFO conversation that's been had seemingly more and more on
Mhm.
I don't know, more dubious scale, depending on whether you trust the government disclosure. But it seems like, for the most part, humans in general are more open to the idea nowadays that we might have visitors from another planet, dimension, etc. What do you make of these UFO encounters? Is this time travelers from our future?
Nobody knows, and I'm I kind of you're forced, as you say, this is like a really fraught kind of topic, and you're forced to decide who you're going to trust. And, unfortunately, right now, the the authorities in the field seem to mostly be people who come out of the government world, the Pentagon and the three-letter agencies, and like, are we supposed to believe them, or is this all a big, disinformation campaign? Who knows? But I tend to trust uh, the the voices who say that yes, this is real. The government has long known that it was real, but that really nobody knows where they come from or what the origin of these things is. I tend to trust that there really isn't a good answer to that. That said, I do think that the time travel argument is, of the hypotheses that are on the table, I think that is the most compelling um, to me. And certainly I'm not the first to say that. I mean, Michael Masters has, written several good books now, making that argument, based on, bringing his understanding of human evolution as a physical anthropologist, uh, to interpreting, many UFO encounter cases. He's built an argument that if there's a realistic hypothesis here, it's the time travel one. I In Becoming Time Faring, I touch on the UFO topic in a couple chapters. I'm building an argument based more on both technological trends and social myths, I guess, that have sort of tended to sideline the topic of time travel, uh, falsely, because there are a lot of myths out there about time travel, and it causes paradox and things like that. They're false. I essentially deconstruct all those ideas, and show how current technological trends are moving toward that. I don't think at this point it's premature to take the UFO phenomenon as evidence that we are going to develop time travel or are in the process of developing time travel, because we just still don't know enough. But certainly, if there are time travelers uh, in the world right now from our future, one place to look for them would be in the UFO sort of phenomenon. So I'm sort of, you know, uh, overlapping a little bit the realm that Michael Masters has talked about. I'm more interested. I don't know what to make of a lot of the encounter cases that he uses as evidence, but certainly the physics of the objects that are encountered by the military and by ordinary people, uh, they have all the hallmarks of technology that manipulates space-time.
Yes.
And that's what a time machine is. And they it the physical behavior, the physical signature of of UFOs very often looks very much like something that is manipulating space-time, which implies some kind of time machine. Um, so I think that the two topics dovetail, and I think, yeah, I think that of all the hypotheses on the table, um, yeah, time travel makes the most sense. I've never been, I'm a huge fan of Jacques Vallée. I know Jacques Vallée. He's, sort of a hero of mine. I His sort of internet dimensional hypothesis has never made a lot of sense to me. And the fact that time is a dimension, that's really, I think, the dimension that makes the most sense as an origin for um, for these things, if they come from an elsewhere, if there's an elsewhere involved.
Hmm.
The idea of coming from other planets, does not make nearly as much sense.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people in the field are kind of coming around to that idea. I think that's becoming a much more mainstream
Right.
version at this point.
Well, and I think we want a human explanation for these things because that seems to fit our experience as the sole intelligent being on the planet for the most part. I mean, obviously, whales and dolphins and bonobos are intelligent in their own way, but we humans seem to be the creators, the technological artificers, right? It's funny you mentioned the time anomaly connection to UFOs because I coincidentally, without even meaning to, 2 weeks ago, I was on a little vacation up in northern New England. I was driving. We were going through this thick, thick fog. I mean, if we were outside of the car, we couldn't even see our hand in front of our face. The fog was so thick. And we're driving very carefully along this highway through the mountains in New Hampshire. And I get off the highway thinking, let's just, slow down and just take it easy because this fog is so thick. We pull off the highway, and sure enough, the first landmark we see is the Indian Head Resort, which is what we were kind of looking for, although it was too foggy. And right there on the side of the road, we had no idea we were going to encounter this. There was a state historical site designated as the Betty and Barney Hill abduction site. And we're driving there
Wow.
like just kind of looking for cool stuff. Had no idea that we were going to run into that.
Yeah.
And turns out we found out from the innkeeper, shout out to the inn on the Golden Pond, Mike, who runs the inn. He told us after we had come back that when Betty and Barney Hill came to, they were in the same town or that same area where we were staying. So the trip that we made was the same trip they made coming from this abduction site to Ashland, New Hampshire. And yeah, I think that the idea that history repeats itself is somehow in there, where when you go to these places, you can potentially interact with the same forces. Now, of course, with the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, there's a lot of people who would say that that was the military or aliens. I think regardless of who's behind it, the fact that that area is strange is still significant. And I think somehow maybe there are places on the planet, whether it's magnetism or the boundaries between this dimension and another are thinner. I don't know what it is, but I think there are places on the earth where maybe we can interact with our precognitive abilities or these time loops in a more direct way. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean that seems to fit with you know the the literature on this subject, that there seem to be places that are, for whatever reason, rich with this. But I just think it's interesting that you know chose to stop your car right at that
Right.
place. I mean, that's to me is precognition. That's that pre-sentimental guidance system that I'm talking about right
Mm,
there.
mm,
It's like, you could have stopped, you know, a quarter of a mile earlier or a quarter of a mile later and never seen that sign,
right.
you know. So
Right.
that's what I'm talking about, the unconscious. Well, that wasn't not your consciousness that was doing that. That was your unconscious. There was something else, uh, making that decision.
Mm.
And yeah,
Well, and for good reason too, because now the podcast has its sticker on that very legendary spot. So
great,
now we'll get some new podcast fans when they
very good.
visit
Yeah,
the site. But I'm curious. You just sort of mentioned that there are a lot of so-called paradoxes that aren't so surrounding time travel. Can we get into some of those misnomers about time travel? What are some of these misimpressions, and do they come from the world of fiction? I know you mentioned H.G. Wells having the credit of writing the first time travel book that became popular, but it wasn't the first. There was another less popular but more accurate time travel story that came out earlier. But yeah, what are some of these misimpressions of time travel?
yeah. Well, the big one is the grandfather paradox. The idea that um, you could go back in time and somehow change the past in a way that makes it impossible for you to be born or for you to get in your time machine, and thus, that it creates this kind of like logical, you know, conundrum that, would, I grew up with Star Trek, so the Star Trek computers would start smoking, that's what, yeah, happens on the Enterprise. The uh this idea that you could change the past, okay, by stepping into a time machine, um, is at the root of well, yeah, a whole lot of science fiction, um, lot of science fiction stories, but it's also at the root of the objection to time travel and the idea of time travel on the part of a lot of physicists over the course of the 20th century, um, who just really balked. Even though Einsteinian physics seems to allow these situations in which you could travel backward in time. It's sort of allowed in the mathematics and so on. And uh and and a few, physicists have gotten really interested in this, like, wow, this is cool. But there's always been sort of a headwind of physicists saying, no, 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 there's got to be rules against time travel, because otherwise you could do what they do in science fiction stories and get in a time machine and go back into the past and change the past, and that causes a paradox, and that's uh and that can't happen. A paradox is by definition something that can't happen. um but the thing is that it's weird that people have not questioned this idea, that you can change the past. That's really a nonsensical notion. It rests on the idea of, like, somehow kind of tricking history. Like, there's a like Stephen Hawking is one of the physicists who, like, just was a naysayer about the idea of time travel. And he would use, like, a little thought experiment, like uh, a physicist building a wormhole into the past, and then so that he could shoot his younger self through the wormhole, okay, and thus prevent his younger self from building the wormhole. Okay, it's like, he would create thought experiments like that. Um, but it depends. That depends. There's no backstory. There's no backstory to that possibility, and physicists are not thinking clearly when they create these scenarios, and likewise science fiction writers, when they create these scenarios, they're not really thinking clearly about the fact that you have to have a history leading up uh, to an event, and that event could be getting into a time machine to go back in time, or getting into, there has to be, if you went back in time and killed your grandfather, uh, preventing you from being born, then there's no you to build the time machine. And so, really, that is just as not part of history. That's just not part. There's no backstory to you getting into a time machine to go back in time and kill your grandfather. And it's as simple as that. It can't happen because it didn't happen. But there are all kinds of ways in which you can go into the past and influence the past. It really boils down to this confusion that people have between changing the past and influencing the past. We can't change the past, but we can influence the past. You can go into the past, do all kinds of things, and that becomes part of your history, getting into the time machine in the first place. There's any infinite range of things that you can do in the past. Uh, the same, and this goes actually back to our discussion about free will, because when people ask about free will, they're having in their head this idea of changing the future. But what are they changing it from? There's no, it's that's another kind of nonsensical idea. There's no changing from what? You are making the future, you are influencing the future with your actions, and you're part of the backstory of the future, but that's not changing the future. And same for the same reason, you can't change the past. But that people, when they hear that you can't change the past, well, that sounds like, well, why would you travel back in time? Well, there's all kinds of reasons to travel back in time. I mean, gain new information. You can, steal things from people in the past. Uh, you could, you know, theoretically create situations in the past that would then manifest uh, in the present. You could, go back in time and purchase, tell your friend to purchase some stock, which will then become valuable, and then go into the future and reap the benefits. There are all kinds of reasons to manipulate the timeline or travel in the timeline. And this notion of grandfather paradox is it's a nothing burger. It's non-existent, and yet it has it has been this kind of mental block for generations, honestly, of scientists, like brilliant scientists like Stephen Hawking, thought that this was a real problem, but but it's just not. It's not. So there's really no rules against time travel. There are obviously technological hurdles, and those are a separate issue, but there are no rules against it. And this idea of paradox, I tell people in my new book, just forget this idea of paradox. It's not a barrier
Hmm.
uh, to time travel.
And just to alleviate maybe my own confusion, I might have gotten hung up on that. When you say there's no backstory there, what you're saying is that by being in the past, you are in effort creating a new reality where you exist, right? So
A new reality, you are simply
you're in
contributing to your
reality,
own history. You're
right?
simply contributing to the history that already led you to get into that time machine in the
Right.
first place.
So there's no like I kill my grandfather and then I phase out of existence. It's just
Right.
you kill your grandfather and then you're a murderer in the past.
No, it wasn't your real grandfather.
Ah, okay. So you kill
You were
a
wrong
person.
about who your grandfather was. You went into the past, you could have gone in the
Yeah,
past trying to kill your grandfather, and uh,
but that just
and
wasn't
it'll turn
him.
out that that wasn't your real grandfather.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That see now I'm starting to alleviate some of that confusion cuz yeah, I can see how someone might get caught up on that, but it's really a logical fallacy. It's not a paradox. It's just
Right.
it's a misguided sort of debunking. So, wow.
The the example that I use in the book, it's really no different from, there are a lot of places okay, so going back and killing your grandfather would be like a place in a thing in time that you can't do. Something in the landscape of time that's off limits to you. But there are a million places in space that are off limits to you too. You can't go to the moon. All right. You personally cannot go to the moon, at least not right now. Okay. And like there's no rocket anywhere that could take you to the moon right now, that nothing that you could hijack. Uh, you didn't study your whole life to be a NASA astronaut and blah, blah, blah. There's just simply no way to go to the moon. It's not a paradox. People have been to the moon. It's possible. The moon is a place that people could go and can go and have gone, but you can't go to the moon. But that's not a paradox. And that's the same reason you can't go and kill your grandfather. There's no backstory putting you in a position to go there. There's no, you
Right.
know, there's no history that would lead you to that place. But all
Right.
these thought experiments about somehow changing the past, they're all predicated on somehow the universe changing its mind, uh, on history changing its mind, or history being tricked somehow. And and that just it just doesn't happen. There's got to be, you can go in the past and do all kinds of things, and that you will find that those were already part of the world of influences that led you to get into that time machine in the first place.
Hmm.
um, and that's the thing, that's the mind-blowing part of it, that when you realize, oh, there's no paradox, but time travel is perfectly allowed, the world could be full of time travelers. The world could be a product of time travel, of time traveling influences of all kinds. But we've never even looked for that because we've had these mental blocks. Well, first of all, no one even thought of time travel until a century or more ago. But then, uh, because of these mental blockades against thinking about time travel and these confusions that we have, no one has taken seriously the idea that the universe might be a product of time travel. That and I sort of, in my book, I sort of use this idea to sort of address or kind of tweak the simulation hypothesis that's very popular now. The idea that we live in a simulation. Well, what if I don't think it's that complicated. I think that you could argue that future intelligences have created have created the universe in a sense through time travel, through retrocausation, and that advanced beings in our future have really been in our past, influencing the universe from the very start. So we could be in the product of a gigantic time loop. Um, that is a very exciting idea that you start to be able to contemplate when you just set aside all these kinds of myths about paradoxes being caused by time travelers. Um, I think the world we live in now could be a product of a lot of time travel. And again, it leads naturally to this idea that, well, maybe that's what the UFO phenomenon or some of the UFO phenomenon might represent. Um, who knows? But there's just there are no rules. There's no intrinsic rules against time travel.
Yeah. Yeah, it brings to mind all the various forms of divination, the obsession of various cultures with prophecy and oracles. I mean, it seems like, yeah, we've known about time travel in a sense. We just haven't known about it in these terms. We've talked about it in terms of reincarnation and karma. And now we're seeing it in a sort of technological light, like the same way we can travel across the world in the journey of a day rather than months. Now we're sort of envisioning, these capsules that we're going to get into to make these journeys, because I guess that's what we're accustomed to, the vehicular nature of the way we travel now. We can sort of conceptualize a vehicle to take us through time, but it doesn't sound like we need that. It seems like Tolkien and Shelley and these figures that you've written about use their mind, use this word we don't really understand, our consciousness.
Well, that's precognition is informational time travel. I mean, it's not, there's nothing physically traveling in time in your brain that's enabling precognition, but information does seem to be able to, travel backward in time. According to a growing number of physicists, particles, carry a bit of information about their future, uh, as well as information about their past. And that information from the future is what was used to be called randomness. It was thought by the sort of mainstream in the physics community that this unpredictable part of behavior at the smallest scales was randomness or uncertainty. Um, but the argument is that no, wait a minute, that's the information associated with that particle that is actually a product of the next thing that the particle is going to interact with. Um, so there's a sense in which at the smallest scales, information is being carried in both directions by matter. And that doesn't depend on things physically traveling backward in time, the way maybe a time machine or what I call a time ship might. There's no need for that to have retrocausation and time traveling information, and that I think is what is happening in the brain and in living systems and so on. Um, uh, but but yeah. So but time travel, literal time travel, is also a possibility, and that involves things like wormholes and special technologies that enable objects to physically move through time in the reverse direction as well as forwards.
Well, how far away from that are we, do you think? I mean, aside
That is a
from,
big question. I mean, uh, it's been thought by mainstream physicists until recently that, oh, well, that's, to create a wormhole that would try, you can create a wormhole theoretically, but that's, thousands of years away and you have to have huge amounts of energy and so on. But there's more and more um, people questioning these assumptions. And certainly there's a lot of discourse in the sort of UFO community now about alternative uh, technologies that have been probably kept secret, since World War II. I know Jesse Michaels has had a number of really good episodes of his podcast on secret anti-gravity research and so on that has been conducted since since World War II, even before. And there's the possibility that there are some like fundamental physics that's been kept secret in order because these potential uses are so destructive or so profitable or whatever that they only exist in very secretive uh, aerospace you know research and so on. So we don't know what has been developed. But when you're talking about anti-gravity, you're you're talking about ways of modifying space-time. And so it's sort of anti-gravity, you know, faster than light travel, these things all sort of connect to the idea of time travel. So if these technologies have been developed, then at least the rudiments, or at least the building blocks of time machines may have been created already. And then of course you get into this issue. Well, maybe some of if the UFO phenomenon is time travelers, and it's true that we are back engineering their crashed saucer material and stuff like that, then it raises all these questions. Well, are we have they been giving us the secret to time travel? Who knows? Um, so I don't know how close we are, but there could come a threshold, sort of a singularity almost, where um, it's already here, essentially because of future time travelers bringing us the technology. Again, in that kind of loop where nothing really has been invented in the sense of, worked out on a chalkboard. It just becomes this kind of thing that manifests. Um, so there's a lot of fun speculation, and that's what the my Becoming Time-Faring book gets into. Um, but I don't know. I don't have any special insight into what has been done in you know in the secret hangars of
Hmm.
Lockheed and and so
Yeah.
on.
Well, and
But there's fun stories, and there's
right.
interesting stories that even the Germans were working on this sort of stuff in the World War II.
I was gonna say, aside from the military stuff, because, it is so heavily redacted and, the whole national security and everything else. But there have been cases of inventors tapping into these precognitive abilities. And I wonder if, some inventor of time travel may do just this. And I don't know, maybe this has already happened. Are you familiar? There was a gentleman that called into Coast to Coast back when Art Bell was still hosting it. And I think he called in once or twice, and then he disappeared. And it was a big mystery. And they tried tracking him down. And I think there was even another podcast within the past 10 years that covered the story in great detail. They went and did some good reporting on the topic, or on the story, and it was this story about a guy who had legitimate scientific know-how. He had some pretty advanced technologies in his shed, and he was using like a literal train that he pulled out of the woods. There was a train, abandoned train station somewhere near his house, and he lived in Canada. And the details of the story aren't that important. It just was kind of mystifying and sounded credible because he disappeared. And as far as the people who knew him could tell, like, he was really working on some pretty strange stuff. As far as time travel, or who knows, I don't know, but it was a pretty popular episode of Coast to Coast, and a lot of people have theorized since that he did time travel and that's why he disappeared. Have you come across any cases like people like that, or do you know of that case or others like it?
I don't know that case. There are a lot of stories like that,
Hmm.
and there's a million stories of inventors working on stuff, and they wind up disappearing or dying of of suspicious you know causes.
Right.
The whole realm of of anti-gravity and zero point energy research is full of stories like this. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because I really, it does seem too dangerous, honestly. So I like to just speculate. Uh, but yeah, there are a lot of stories like that. And again, to me, the most interesting is um, uh, Townsend Brown, Thomas Townsend Brown, the inventor who there's a recent book by Paul Shotskin.
We've had him on the show, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's a fascinating story, and it sounds, he certainly in his, very early on realized that the anti-gravity stuff was connected to time travel, and then Nick Cook in his book talks about, the really intriguing possibility that the Germans were working on, something related to that uh, in in secret in the last years of World War II. Who knows? And who knows what became of that after the war? But no, there's enough. I think there are enough hints that these technologies have been pursued for a long time, and who knows what has been created. Given many decades now. Uh, it's certainly an exciting thing to speculate about, but you know, there's so much secrecy around
Well,
this stuff.
and very frightening to think that one group of people could take such a huge advantage over the rest of us. Um, not that they are altogether, you know, going to do it for evil ends. I think that's one of the great kind of misnomers of our age is that the powers that be are absolutely corrupted, absolutely could be the case. I mean, it's not unfounded to think that, but I have a little bit more hope that maybe there are some sort of, again, boundaries to them being able to use time travel to completely dominate the rest of us. It doesn't sound like there are many limitations based on what you're saying, but in a sense, would a group of people in the deep state traveling back in time, based on what you've researched, could they do something like reorganize the structure of our society to make us even more enslaved than we already are?
Yeah, there are all kinds of possibilities. I mean, I run through a lot of them in Becoming Time Faring, and there are positive ones and there's negative ones. And like with any technological advance, um, it's always going to be a mix. There's going to be a mix of positive and negative that comes from this. And yeah, I mean, it's going to be probably initially extremely secretive and used for war, and for getting very rich. So whatever tech oligarch, on his secret island creates a time machine is going to use it to get rich, basically. But the hope is that, as with other technologies, this will not be held as a monopoly of one power or person or whatever, and that and if it emerges in you know multiple nation states, multiple corporations, whatever, that may serve to keep things in check a little bit. I don't know, that's my hope.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, my book is sort of an optimist, more tries to be optimistic about the future of time travel and the possibilities there. But yeah, I think we do have to be cognizant of these potential threats, or dangers of it as well. And I think for so many people, there's just this mental block that, oh, time travel, that's not possible. I've heard that it causes paradox, so it can't be possible. I'm trying to get people to erase
Right.
that notion from their head, because we need to start thinking realistically about these possibilities, both good and bad. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And rightly so, considering that it is at the heart of some of the biggest breakthroughs of our modern age. I mean, you mentioned how Einsteinian physics allows for this to happen. And yeah, I think this is a pretty groundbreaking, major upheaval causing type of concept that people should be aware of. And of course, this is a conspiracy podcast, so we're going to be skeptical and say, oh, well, maybe the powers that be want us to be ignorant of time travel so they can use it against us. And if that is the case, Eric, I thank you for doing what you're doing to help, dispel the ignorance and show people what the truth is and where to find it. And you have 5 books now altogether, maybe more, but 5 it seems. So they're all really excellent, well written. We only had a chance to talk about a few of them today, but all of them can be found at ericwargo.com, which is linked in today's episode description. And thank you so much for joining me, Eric. Before we wrap up, final thoughts, anything that the audience can look forward to from you next, things that you have to promote, etc.?
Yeah, so I just republished my first book, Time Loops, with a new foreword by Jeffrey Kripal, if you know who that is. He's a religion professor at Rice University who talks a lot about the paranormal. And so there's a new edition of that out, and I'm going to be teaching it as a course, actually, for the first time through Morbid Anatomy, starting in about a month. So at the end of April, so people can get on the Morbid Anatomy website if they're interested in taking a 6-week course on time loops.
Right on. Wow, awesome. And maybe after taking this course, they can tap into their own time loop, get into that creative precognitive flow. I love it. We talk a little bit about it on this show with synchronicity, and so yeah, I'd love to have you back on in the future to continue the conversation because there is so much more to talk about. But I appreciate your time. Thank you again for joining me, Eric, and I hope the audience supports you and follows up with you. The links, again, are in the description, folks. And until next episode, thank you for tuning in and immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.